The military simulation ground to a standstill. A single phrase in Arabic, crucial to the mission, had been mistranslated. Confusion rippled across the room as 5 nations' troops froze, unsure of their next move. Then came a quiet voice, low, deliberate, from the back of the room. He said, "Hold position, not advance." Silence fell. Heads turned. Standing in the shadows near the equipment racks was a man no one had noticed. Gray hair, blue janitor uniform. Monroe stitched on his chest. A mop in one hand, resolve in his eyes. A general stepped forward slowly, brows furrowed. "How do you know that?" The old man inhaled, steady and calm, as if unlocking a door inside himself. "I spent 3 decades hearing things like that, before anyone handed me a mop." Fort Lancer woke before the sun. By the time most people reached for their first coffee, the base had already been alive for hours. Helicopter blades cut through the chilled Arizona sky. Boots thundered against the gravel training paths in rhythmic unison. Somewhere a loudspeaker barked orders in clipped English, while another echoed German phrases for a visiting NATO unit. The air smelled of fuel, sand, and the quiet intensity of discipline. Fort Lancer wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient. A self-contained organism, powered by clockwork routines and camouflage bodies. But while the soldiers drew headlines and salutes, there was another force that kept the base running. Quiet, unnoticed, essential. The janitorial staff. You didn't see them unless the floors were dirty or the toilets clogged. They moved like phantoms through metal corridors, pushing carts and hauling bins, while conversations about international protocol buzzed just over their heads. To Private Jordan Vega, a newly assigned infantry recruit, the janitors were just background noise, until he noticed one in particular. The man was old, much older than anyone else on the cleaning crew. His back was straight, his hands precise. His name tag read, Monroe. Every morning at 5:1 sharp, Monroe would walk into the East Wing, mop in one hand, folded cloth in the other. No small talk, no complaints. He never slouched. And unlike most janitors, he made eye contact with officers when they passed. Not out of defiance, but from a habit long formed and never broken. "Who's that guy?" Vega once whispered to a fellow private, watching the man polish the hallway just outside the strategy center. "Him. That's Elias. Been here since before I got assigned. Quiet guy. Doesn't say much. Ex-military, I think." That made Vega pause. Something about the way the old man moved did feel different. It wasn't just muscle memory. It was presence. Like he'd walked through fire and come out with his dignity perfectly intact. What Vega didn't know, what almost no one on base knew, was that Elias Monroe had once held a clearance level higher than most of the brass now stomping past him. 45 years earlier, Berlin, 1978. Elias was 26 and fluent in 4 languages already. The Cold War didn't feel cold in the back alleys of East Germany. It felt like a blade pressed against the ribs. He wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense. No rifle slung over his shoulder, no medals displayed on his chest. But his missions were lethal in a quieter way, intercepting communications, decoding enemy movements, disappearing into cities no one remembered. He could mimic accents, detect lies by breath patterns, and had once translated a 3-hour negotiation between 2 hostile generals without a single note. Intelligence officers knew him by code name, Shade Owl. Allies trusted him. Enemies feared he might be listening. His career stretched over decades. Assignments in Riyadh, Ankara, Sarajevo. By the 1980s, he was fluent in 7 languages. By 2001, he was stationed at Kandahar, decoding intercepted cell transmissions that often meant the difference between a roadside bomb and a safe convoy. But behind the skill and service, Alice was also a husband and father. He married Miriam, a military nurse from Delaware, in 1985. They raised 2 children across a blur of deployments and relocations, from Germany to Korea, Virginia to Qatar. Miriam held the family together with laughter, letters, and late-night prayers. Then, the unexpected. Cancer took her in 2016. Elias didn't break down. He simply dimmed. The funeral was small. He wore his uniform one last time. After the service, he folded it carefully and put it away, like closing a chapter with trembling hands. When retirement came, Elias wasn't ready. Not financially, not emotionally, and certainly not mentally. He still woke at dawn, still reviewed foreign news sites in multiple languages, still kept his hearing sharp by listening to military chatter online. But the job offers didn't come. He applied for contractor positions, analyst roles, teaching spots at military academies. Rejections stacked up. Some were polite, others blunt. "You're highly experienced, Mr. Monroe, but our needs are evolving. Frankly, sir, we're looking for someone younger, with current certifications. Your background is impressive, but your profile is outdated." Outdated. That word followed him like a shadow. Not failed, not unqualified, just discarded. Eventually, the pension began to run thin. Bills crept up, rent rose, groceries felt heavier by the month. His old hands, once fluent in code-switching Russian and Farsi, now gripped receipts and coupon clippings. Then one morning, he saw a bulletin. Janitor wanted, part-time Fort Lancer. Operations building must pass base security clearance. Start. Immediate. He didn't think twice. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same halls where he once briefed NATO translators now needed mopping. But Elias wasn't proud, he was practical. And he missed the rhythm of the base, the sound of boots, the pulse of order. So he reapplied, got cleared, and put on the blue uniform without complaint. Most saw a quiet old man with sharp eyes and silent steps, a ghost in a hallway. But some, like Private Vega, couldn't help but feel something deeper was hidden behind that mop and faded name tag. A sense that this man wasn't cleaning floors. He was watching, listening, waiting. And the moment he'd step out of the shadows would be the moment the world realized it had misjudged him all along. The multinational simulation had been planned for 8 months. 5 nations, 1 operation, 0 room for error. At Fort Lancer's West Command Building, dubbed the Core, nearly 200 officers, techs, and observers assembled under the dim light of projectors in multi-language HUDs. NATO flags lined the rear wall. Computerized terrain models were rendered in real time across a digital floor the size of a basketball court. The scenario was grim but realistic. A hostile militia had taken civilians hostage near a contested border. Rapid insertion and synchronized maneuvering were essential. Units from the United States, France, Germany, Poland, and Italy would coordinate in a complex rescue op. All communication had to be managed through a central linguistic AI. The stakes were high, not just politically but financially. The operation had cost over $300,000 in planning, equipment, and international logistics, and it was falling apart by the second. A voice crackled over the comms in Arabic. "Irtafadhu bimawqi'akum." The translation AI blinked. Text rolled across the English screen. "Advance." A second later, the U.S. battalion leader repeated, "Advance on target. Move forward." But Elias Monroe, who had been polishing a metal railing outside the simulation floor, froze mid-motion. His brow tightened. He looked up at the digital board. "Advance," he murmured. "No, that's not what he said." Inside, the simulated troops repositioned on the live map. French and Polish teams hesitated, confused. The German commander barked into his headset. Italian comms erupted in dispute. Then came the chaos. "Stop! Stop everything!" shouted the German Major Weber, slamming his hand on the console. "That's not the command." Colonel Armand Dupont from the French side stepped away from the screen. "We were told to hold our perimeter. Why are they advancing?" General Calvin Briggs stood at the center of the room, jaw clenched, his arms crossed over a crisp olive uniform. "Get me the translation logs, now." A tech scrambled to pull up the data. "Sir, it's coming from the AI interface. Arabic to English says advance. Cross-referenced with field usage, it still reads as..." "That's wrong," said a calm voice behind them. Everyone turned. At the threshold between the hall and simulation room stood Elias Monroe. He held his mop like a staff, his blue uniform dull beneath the fluorescent lights. "The actual phrase," he said, "was hold your position, not advance." A long silence followed. The general narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" Elias stepped forward slowly, respectful, composed. The system's correct in literal structure, but in context, in dialect, the phrase isn't aggressive, it's defensive. It's a command to wait, not move. Major Weber furrowed his brow. Who is he? Briggs didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Monroe. And how do you know that? Elias paused. The weight of 3 decades rested behind his voice. Because I've heard that command issued in live conflict zones. In Kandahar, in Baghdad, in a village outside Mosul. I've interpreted it while artillery fell less than half a mile away. One of the Polish commanders muttered in disbelief. The German team glanced at one another. Briggs stepped closer, scanning the older man's face. His voice dropped just slightly. Name? Elias Monroe. Not your uniform name, your full name and former rank. Elias took a breath. First Sergeant Elias Monroe. Retired. Army Intelligence. A murmur swept the room. Briggs froze. Wait, Monroe? Monroe. It hit him. The intel reports, the redacted documents with a handler code name, Shade Owl. They were a part of his own training archive decades ago. You were assigned to Operation Ember Cross in 1987, weren't you? Elias nodded once. My God, you're that Monroe. A complete reversal swept through the room. General Briggs didn't hesitate. Sergeant Monroe, if you're willing, I could use your assistance, right now. I'll do what I can, sir. Good. He turned to his stunned staff. He's now temporarily assigned as linguistic oversight. Pull up all active language channels. We fix this now. Elias set the mop against the wall without ceremony and walked calmly to the console. His eyes scanned the monitor like an old pianist sitting back at his familiar keys. Pull the French overlay. Cross-check it with Field Directive 17.4. The phrase maintenez la ligne is being misread as retreat in the Italian system. How the hell do you know that? Dupont asked, baffled. I taught French military interpreters for 7 years, Elias replied evenly. I know what they meant, not just what they said. For the next 20 minutes, the simulation ran again, this time flawlessly. Elias adjusted tonal discrepancies, fixed contextual conflicts, and bridged subtle cultural assumptions that no machine could translate. Soldiers stopped looking at the monitors. They started listening to him. He switched between German and Arabic, French and Italian, without pause. Not a textbook recitation, but with the fluidity of a man who had negotiated ceasefires and interrogated double agents. By the time the exercise ended, the multinational teams were communicating seamlessly. The room broke into applause. General Briggs gave a rare, slight smile. You just saved a $250,000 simulation and avoided one hell of an international embarrassment. Elias only replied, Glad I could be useful, sir. But as the room cleared and the generals moved to debrief, Private Vega, standing near the back, having observed the entire exchange, looked at Monroe with awe. He turned to the janitor who'd mopped their hallways every morning. You were never just cleaning floors, were you? Elias glanced at him, eyes sharp but kind. No, son, he said quietly. I was just waiting for someone to listen. The next morning, Elias Monroe was no longer invisible. He was no longer pushing a mop down the hallway of the West Wing, no longer nodding silently at passing officers who never looked back. Instead, he was seated behind a folding desk in the main operations room, reviewing multilingual communication protocols with a red pen in one hand and a half-drunk cup of lukewarm coffee in the other. A laminated visitor badge hung from his shirt collar. Below it, a plain white card with 3 typed words, Temporary Language Consultant. For some, it was a welcome sight. The international team who had witnessed the previous day's incident treated Elias with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. French Captain Latre had even stopped by to shake his hand before catching a flight out. But within the American ranks, particularly among the younger officers, the response was mixed. The first to raise an eyebrow was Lieutenant Nathan Bishop, 32, West Point graduate, and one of Fort Lancer's rising stars. Sharp jawline, sharp resume. He had multiple overseas deployments under his belt and a certificate in international conflict mediation framed above his desk. To him, Monroe's sudden appearance felt unnatural, unfair. How do you go from mop to mission critical in 24 hours? He asked another officer in the mess hall that afternoon. I'm not saying the guy didn't serve, but this, just walking into our most sensitive exercises like he belongs here? A few tables over, Major Randall Cooper stirred his tea, quiet but listening. Cooper was in his late 40s, tall and clean-cut, with a permanent look of dignified disapproval. For the past decade, he had served as Fort Lancer's lead linguistic strategist, a role he took great pride in, and now a retired janitor was sitting at the same table he once commanded alone. Cooper's smile didn't reach his eyes when he finally met Elias. "I heard you saved the operation yesterday," he said, voice smooth as glass. "Impressive. You must be very intuitive." Elias simply nodded. "Just familiar with the languages, that's all." "Yes," Cooper said, folding his hands. "Though familiarity isn't the same as certification, of course." Elias gave a quiet smile. "No, it isn't. But sometimes it's more useful." That was the beginning of the unspoken war. The resistance begins. At the first internal briefing Elias attended, Cooper made his move. "This morning we'll be reviewing protocol drafts in Ukrainian and Polish," he announced to the room of officers. "We've invited Mr. Monroe to sit in and observe, given his recent contributions." Elias didn't flinch at the passive jab. As the meeting began, Cooper directed most of his explanations toward the whiteboard, where he drew needlessly complicated charts on linguistic overlaps. Bishop leaned over to Elias and whispered, "You're going to need a degree in cryptography to follow his logic." "I don't need the logic," Elias replied calmly. "I need the field." Halfway through, Cooper read a sentence aloud from a Polish tactical manual and turned to Elias. "Would you agree with this translation, Sergeant?" Elias scanned the phrase. "The word odrot here doesn't mean withdraw in a military sense," he said. "It means fall back to secondary position." "There's a distinction," Cooper smiled politely. "That may be so in casual usage, but the software interprets it as a full retreat." "And that's why your last simulation failed," Elias said, still looking at the document. "The Polish unit thought they were being abandoned." The room fell silent. Even Bishop tilted his head slightly. Cooper cleared his throat. "Noted." The trap. It didn't take long for Cooper to take it further. 3 days later, Elias was handed a last-minute assignment: lead the real-time translation during a video conference with German and Italian officers coordinating a NATO training sequence. No prep files, no briefing, just a calendar invite. Elias arrived 5 minutes early. The room was already full. Cooper leaned against the wall in the back, arms folded, his expression neutral. Too neutral. Bishop, assigned as secondary translator, glanced over. "You get the materials for this?" "No," Elias said, adjusting his glasses. "But I'll manage." The call began. First, the German officer spoke rapidly about convoy timing and alternate infiltration routes. Elias listened, then translated, not just word for word, but tone for tone. Then came the Italian side, full of military idioms, regional slang, and clipped shorthand. Elias adapted on the fly, adjusting phrasing and cadence to avoid confusion. He even paused once to ask the German major for clarification, in fluent Berlin-accented German, which earned a surprised but appreciative nod. By the end of the 40-minute session, the officers signed off with compliments and a joke in Italian that Elias translated effortlessly, causing the whole room to chuckle. Afterward, as the rest of the team filed out, Bishop turned to Cooper. "You forgot to send him the materials, didn't you?" Cooper said nothing, but the damage was already undone. Recognition and respect. Later that afternoon, General Briggs summoned Elias to his office. "I heard about the call," he said. "Good recovery." "It was manageable." Briggs leaned forward. "I also heard Major Cooper didn't give you the materials." Elias gave a small nod. "I suspected as much. Why didn't you report it?" "Because, sir," Elias said, "insecure men expose themselves. You just have to give them enough rope." Briggs let out the briefest of laughs. "You're still sharp as ever." He stood and walked to the window. "Listen, I know some of the team is having a hard time adjusting. They see your experience as a challenge. That's not your fault." "It's not theirs either," Elias said softly. "It's just what happens when people mistake age for irrelevance. Bridges, not walls." The next morning, Elias arrived at the meeting room early. He placed 2 dictionaries on the table, one German, one Arabic, and waited. Lieutenant Bishop walked in, holding a folder. "I looked into that fallback term you corrected the other day," he said. "You were right. We've been misusing it for years." Elias looked up. "You know," Bishop added, "you made me uncomfortable at first. Thought maybe you skipped the line. But after yesterday, I think I get it." "I didn't skip the line," Elias said. "I just walked it before you were born." Bishop chuckled. "You teach seminars?" "Only when someone's ready to listen." He gestured to the chair beside him. Bishop sat down. They spent the next hour going over 3 languages side by side, not as officer and janitor, but as professionals. 3 weeks into Elias Monroe's unexpected return to military operations, the call came in. A NATO joint exercise in Poland had gone terribly wrong. At Camp Vistula, just outside Krakow, American and German units had been participating in Operation Iron Dusk, a large-scale urban assault simulation designed to stress-test Allied cooperation under pressure. It was meant to be routine, controlled, predictable. Instead, it teetered on the edge of real conflict. The miscommunication started small. A German squad radioed in a warning about structural hazards in a simulated building. But the American unit misinterpreted it as an accusation of negligence. Tensions rose, words hardened, orders became clipped, protocols contradicted each other. Then someone drew a training weapon, foam-tipped, harmless, but symbolically lethal. The exercise was called off instantly. Within an hour, both command centers had sealed communications. By the next morning, diplomatic liaisons were called in. And by noon, General Calvin Briggs stood outside Elias Monroe's temporary office, arms crossed. "Pack a bag, Sergeant. You're going to Poland." Elias arrived at Ramstein Air Base the next morning, then flew commercial to Krakow, accompanied by 1 communications officer and a leather satchel containing 6 worn dictionaries, a flash drive of archived NATO language protocols, and a notepad. When he stepped onto the Polish base, the mood was brittle. German and American personnel avoided eye contact. Briefings were being held in separate buildings. Rumors of disrespect, incompetence, and tactical superiority complexes floated just beneath the surface. Commanders on both sides looked like they'd aged a year and a day. Elias didn't ask to be introduced. He simply observed. For 4 hours, he sat quietly in both sides' debriefings, not offering commentary, only taking notes. He listened to both German and American commanding officers describe the same event, and realized almost immediately, they weren't disagreeing on actions. They were disagreeing on language. That evening, he requested a joint meeting. The American officer, Colonel Dean Johnson, seemed skeptical but relented. The German officer, Oberstleutnant Henrik Miller, arrived stiffly but polite. The room was plain. Concrete walls, a long wooden table, no translators. Elias stood at the head. "Gentlemen," he began, "thank you for coming. I'll keep this short." Johnson folded his arms. "With respect, we've been through this. The Germans implied our squad ignored hazard flags." "We didn't imply," Miller interjected. "We said the Americans failed to meet Mindus Protocol. Basic protocol." Elias nodded. "There it is," he said softly. "That phrase, that's our problem." The 2 men looked at him. Elias wrote the word on a whiteboard. Mindus Protocol. "In German doctrine," he explained, "this phrase refers to the absolute minimum required for safety. It's a baseline, not a critique. But in English, when someone says you're following the minimum, it sounds like you're doing the least amount possible. Slacking. Negligent." Johnson blinked. Miller raised an eyebrow. Elias continued. "You're using the same term, but with different assumptions. One sees it as caution, the other hears it as condemnation." He paused, letting the tension breathe. "I propose we use a new shared term moving forward in these simulations. In English, we'll say enhanced safety protocol, implying active effort. In German, erweitertes Sicherungsprotokoll. Both are positive. Both imply cooperation." The 2 men looked at each other. Slowly, the defensive edge faded. Miller finally nodded. "That is acceptable." Johnson leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "It's more than acceptable. It's a hell of a lot better than what we've been doing." Elias smiled. "Then let's fix this before someone makes a real mistake." Over the next 36 hours, Elias worked with both camps to revise their communication handbooks. He facilitated 3 more joint sessions, each one smoother than the last. He corrected the meaning of Vorfeldsicherung, adjusted the American understanding of sector sweep, and helped the German translator better interpret American expressions like hold the line. But more than that, he changed the tone. He taught soldiers to look past words and into intent. He told stories from his own deployments where a single word saved lives and where assuming the worst nearly cost everything. He didn't give lectures, he gave context. And context more than grammar or phonetics was what they all needed. By the time he boarded the flight back to Arizona, German soldiers saluted him. American personnel clapped him on the shoulder, and one young Polish officer simply whispered, "Thank you for listening." At Fort Lancer, General Briggs waited in his office with a fresh report in hand. Elias stepped in, as calm and unassuming as ever. "Well?" Briggs asked. Elias handed him a document. "Exercise recommenced. Tensions resolved. New terminology adopted. No further incidents." Briggs flipped through the report. "The Germans sent a formal commendation," he said. "They called you diplomatically brilliant. Also said your German grammar is better than their own translators." Elias gave a modest smile. "I had a good teacher. Her name was Ilsa. She taught me when I was 19. Smuggled books into East Berlin." Briggs shook his head with a chuckle. "You're something else, Monroe." "No, sir. Just someone who knows how easily things fall apart when no one's paying attention." Briggs stood, walked around the desk, and extended a hand. Elias took it. "You won't find a medal waiting, you know," the general said. "I'm not looking for one. But people talk, and what they're saying now is different." Elias nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." Later that night, Elias walked past the janitor's wing. They hadn't moved his locker. His mop was still there. But now soldiers didn't look through him. They nodded. Some even stood up when he passed. Not because of his badge, not because of his temporary title, but because word had spread. The old man knew what he was doing. He had walked into a battlefield of miscommunication and diffused it with nothing but insight, patience, and a deep understanding that sometimes the most dangerous weapons weren't bullets, but badly chosen words. 3 days after returning from Poland, Elias Monroe found a plain envelope on his desk. No stamp, no return address. Just 5 words written in neat block letters for Sergeant Elias Monroe. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. "Sergeant Monroe, you don't know me, but I know who you are. My name is Mark Delgado. I served in the 2nd Marine Division for 17 years. After I left the Corps, I tried to find my place again, but nothing stuck. I ended up working night shifts as a security guard outside a warehouse in Phoenix. No one calls me sergeant anymore. Some days I feel like I was never anything at all. Then I heard about you, about what happened at Fort Lancer, that you used to mop the same halls you once protected, that you stepped up and reminded them who you really were and who they'd forgotten. Your story gave me something I didn't even realize I'd lost. Hope. Last week I updated my resume for the first time in 6 years. I listed my military experience at the top. I don't know if I'll get a better job, but I know I'm not done yet. Thank you. Mark Delgado." Elias read the letter 3 times. By the 3rd reading, he sat still for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly in his fingers. That afternoon, Elias requested a private meeting with General Briggs. He didn't bring reports or data sheets. He brought the letter. Briggs read it silently, jaw tightening ever so slightly near the end. Then Elias spoke. "There are thousands like him, sir. Men and women who still have something to give, but nobody looks at them long enough to see it." Briggs nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" Elias leaned forward. "A program, low overhead, high impact. We identify veterans with unique, underutilized expertise, linguistics, logistics, tactical strategy, communications. We integrate them into non-combat consultant roles at bases across the country. Not charity, mission-critical assignments. We call it the Veteran Specialist Reintegration Program, VSRP." Briggs didn't hesitate. "Write it up." 2 weeks later, Elias stood before a small team in a dusty room on the 2nd floor of Fort Lancer's admin building. The door still creaked. The air conditioner sputtered. But this was the start of something real. His first hire? Mark Delgado. When Mark arrived from Phoenix, his handshake was firm, but his eyes watery. "I never thought I'd wear a badge again, sir," he whispered. "You've earned more than that," Elias replied. "Welcome to the team." Delgado became regional security coordinator, overseeing base transition protocols for retired military personnel in the Southwest. In the months that followed, Elias traveled across the country: Fort Lexington in Kentucky, Camp Arden in North Carolina, Base Holloway in Nevada. At each stop, he met veterans who had been working as cashiers, cab drivers, parking lot attendants, all with decades of military experience and nothing but silence to show for it. The VSRP changed that. They were evaluated, retrained, and reassigned, not out of pity, but out of necessity. Their skills filled gaps, their insight fixed decades-old blind spots, and the results were undeniable. By the end of year 2, the program had placed over 2,400 veterans into critical roles. By year 5, 10,000. The Department of Defense estimated over $37 million saved in consulting fees and contractor outsourcing. But the real gains couldn't be measured in spreadsheets. They came in stories, like the one from Captain Nora Vasquez, a former logistics officer turned waitress in a truck stop diner. Now she managed NATO supply chains for joint training operations. Elias kept her letter in the same drawer as Mark's. "Sergeant Monroe, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. Not thanked, needed. My daughter told me last week I've started laughing more. I told her I think it's because I remember who I am again. You didn't just give me a job. You gave me back my uniform, even if I don't wear it anymore. Forever grateful. Nora Vasquez." At age 78, Elias announced his retirement, this time on his terms. The courtyard at Fort Lancer filled with hundreds, vets from every branch, officers from 5 bases, members of Congress, a few diplomats, even foreign generals who had worked with him in past conflicts. There were no fireworks, no parades, just respect. He stood at the podium in a plain suit, no ribbons, no rank. "When I came back here as a janitor," he began, "I thought my best years were behind me. I thought I had been shelved, like an old book no one reaches for anymore." He paused, letting the silence settle. "But I've learned something. Value doesn't vanish with age. Skill doesn't fade just because a title does. And dignity, well, dignity isn't granted. It's lived." He looked around the courtyard, making eye contact with young soldiers, old friends, and new allies. "We veterans carry more than history. We carry wisdom. The kind you can't teach in a classroom or code into a machine. My final mission has been to make sure the world doesn't forget that." Applause rose not in bursts, but as a wave, quiet, steady, deeply earned. That evening, before leaving the base for the last time, Elias stopped by the janitor's wing. He opened his old locker. Inside hung the same faded blue uniform, the name tag E. Monroe still stitched across the chest. He touched it for a long moment. Then he folded it neatly and placed it on a hanger beside the cleaning supplies. A note pinned to the sleeve read, "This uniform reminded me that no one is invisible, not forever." Elias Monroe's story reminds us of something this world often forgets. True experience doesn't retire. It just waits quietly to be respected again. In today's fast-moving culture, where tech moves faster than conversation and youth is sometimes mistaken for capability, it's easy to overlook those who've already walked through the fire. Veterans, elders, retirees, people who no longer wear uniforms or titles, but still carry the wisdom of decades inside them. Elias wasn't given a second chance because he demanded it. He earned it quietly through patience, integrity, and a moment of courage that reminded the world. Some people still have more to give if we're willing to look past their age and see their worth. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. How many Elias Monroes do we pass by every day? How many former soldiers, teachers, mechanics, or nurses are working quiet jobs, holding stories and skills no one ever asked them about? More importantly, what would change if we did start asking? Let's open that conversation. In the comments below, tell us, have you ever felt overlooked because of age or background? Do you believe our country is doing enough to help veterans and retirees find new purpose? What stories are still untold in your own life or in someone you love? We'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching and listening today. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it. Not for the algorithm, but because someone out there might need to hear this message today. Until next time, take care of each other. And remember, dignity doesn't come from the role you hold. It comes from the life you've lived.